Today is January 18th, 2017. My name is Jenny Matz, and it is my great honor to be interviewing Joshua Brand for the Archive of American Television and the Writers Guild Foundation in New York City.
Hi.
Hi. One take.
Yeah.
Okay.
You're good.
Well, it's the same script, so I get to,
Yeah.
I get to practice it a lot. Okay. You good?
Yeah.
I didn't mark a thing. Okay. Thanks so much for sitting with us, Josh.
Thank you.
We are really starting at the beginning. It's going to get about 10 minutes to talk about your early childhood. So what was your name at birth, and when and where were you born?
Joshua Brand, no middle name. I was born in New York City. What was the rest of the question?
When?
When? 1950, November 29th, 1950.
That adds up. Okay. And can you tell us your parents' names and what they did for a living?
My dad's name was Jack Brand, and he was well, back in the day we called him a tile man. He was a tile setter. He, in your bathrooms today, back in the day, most of it was tile, and he did the tile work. A Jewish tile man. There weren't a lot of them. And my mother is Miriam Brand, and she was a mother and a house person. You know, she just took care of the kids, and she didn't work outside of the home. And I'm the youngest of 4 siblings, and my parents were immigrants.
From where?
They were from Poland, and they came here before the war. I mean, they had their lives were very sort of peripatetic. I mean, they were born in what was the Austro-Hungarian Empire before World War I, and my mother, kind of like immigrants from South America, her father had gone to Belgium to get work, and then when after about 10 years, he brought the family over there. And my father grew up in a shtetl where, seeing a photo of his family, it looks like the Hole in the Wall gang from a old Western. And when he was 21, he left home and became a costume peddler, which was sort of a door-to-door salesman. And my parents met in Palestine. And then they came to the United States, and they had, at that time, it was very difficult to get a visa to get into the United States before World War II. But apparently, this is at least the story that my father told, that if you had $1,000, you could get in as a capitalist. And so he was there was the first Intifada in Palestine. It was very difficult to earn a living, and that's where he learned to be a tile setter. And anyway, he had $1,000, and they came to America, and my oldest sister, my mother was pregnant with my oldest sister, and they came to Williamsburg, Brooklyn, which is now one of the coolest places. And my oldest son, who came to New York, went to Williamsburg, so it sort of came full circle. When my father came to America, he came to Williamsburg, and now, of course, any hipster sort of wants to go to Williamsburg. So that's kind of the history of Williamsburg and my history in a nutshell.
All of it together.
Yeah.
Would you say you inherited any traits from your parents?
Yeah, I'm told I look like my dad, and but he was a tiny. They were both little people. They were very diminutive. My mother stood on my father's shoulders, they'd be as tall as I was. But that's because back in the day they had never had a vegetable until they were like 30. I mean, so as diets have changed, we see people around the world in different cultures who we used to think were short have become very tall. And so he had a really good sense of humor, and like a lot of immigrants who were not particularly well educated, they were very, they each spoke like 5 or 6 languages, and but they didn't learn it in school. And they were clearly really smart people, but just not book smart in the way that, they never really sort of became Americanized. They sort of never became part of the American culture. And I think probably the trait is that it's not really a trait that I inherited from them, but they spoke Yiddish in the house, in the apartment where I grew up. And I didn't know any other people who spoke Yiddish. So interestingly enough, I can understand their Yiddish, but not other people's Yiddish. And I think if you grow up and your parents are sort of different than other people's parents, there's a lot of ways you can sort of adjust to that. And one of the ways, which is sort of is sort of a good thing for a writer, is you become an observer, and you sort of, not consciously, you just want to, you realize that other people's families are different than your family, and you begin sort of noticing that and to fit in, so that people aren't sort of looking at you and going, oh, you know, your parents are different than than the parents of the kids who you go to school with. So I think that that's a function of growing up when your parents are outside of the culture. And I think, when we talk about, not me, but you talk about, for example, a director like Ang Lee, who makes wonderful movies about the American culture, and you go, well, he's not born in this culture. But as a result of that, you really have to sort of develop your observational skills in a way that the rest of us who are in the culture don't really pay attention to. It's kind of living in a city and not going, have you ever been you live in New York, have you gone to the top of the Empire State Building? No. Or the Statue of Liberty? No. But when you're from another place, that's what you sort of are drawn to. And I think that that was sort of and is an advantage, or if not an advantage, it's a good thing for a writer, as opposed to things that can be a liability, like having a bad memory, which I have, a terrible memory. And so for years I thought that was an occupational liability, and I don't necessarily think that anymore. But I also think that having parents who are outside of the culture was a good thing.
Mm. I mean, that sounds like it directly informed the whole us-them outsider perspective in a lot of the shows that came later, too.
I think so, and I think it also informs why I am, I'm not a guy who has spent his life doing one kind of thing. I mean, we know writers and directors who, do cop shows or do lawyer shows, or, film directors who are in one genre. And I have sort of avoided that, not consciously, but I think I'm drawn to different kinds of experiences. So, I've done a medical show. I've never really done a cop show. But I didn't, of course, if you do something that's successful, people want you to repeat it. And I've pretty much avoided doing that. And I tend to get bored, and I tend to want to do something very different than what I've done before. And I think that's also a function of just feeling, I don't know if I'm not more of an outsider. Everybody probably feels like an outsider to some extent. I don't know that anybody doesn't, but that it sort of made me interested in different kinds of experiences, because they were all different than, it was all trying to see how I would fit in different kinds of scenarios, or different kinds of cultures, or different kinds of work experiences and stuff like that. And then once I sort of acclimated myself to that, I would want to move on.
Going back to growing up in that household, did you have a television? Was television something you were aware of or were interested in?
Yeah, we did. And my father loved Bonanza. And, he's a hardworking guy. I mean, he, would go to work early in the morning and work 6 days a week, and he'd come home, and he wasn't a particularly, he would be tired, but he loved Bonanza. And again, there's a guy who grew up in a shtetl in, in Poland, Radomyśl, and he would love watching this television show about, the Cartwrights and, the Ponderosa. And I remember that. And I remember watching television, of course, but it was never something, again, my parents wouldn't have known, they didn't have the good taste to have bad taste, meaning they weren't sort of that generation like a Barry Levinson in his movies about Baltimore, people who wanted to have, Cadillacs, that they really were not like that. And so they didn't know who maybe they knew who Marlon Brando was, but they wouldn't have known who, played third base for the New York Yankees, Clete Boyer. They never sort of became part of that world. So television was not something that we talked about, or movies weren't something we talked about. I think the first movie I ever saw with my parents is when they came to visit me in California when my first kid was born. We went to see E.T., And that was the first movie that I can ever think that I went to see with my parents. And they, of course, loved it. But that was not my experience growing up. It wasn't a part of my world or my gestalt, or it wasn't an ambition. And in terms of writers, back when I was growing up in the 50s and, of course, the 60s, I didn't know anyone who went to film school. I didn't know that there was such a thing as film school. My idea of writers were poets and novelists and playwrights and short story writers and journalists, I suppose. So it was just something that was pleasurable, that our family would sit together and watch television, the Ed Sullivan Show, stuff like that.
What were some of your interests growing up? Were you into sports?
Sports. I was a big sporty guy, and I liked to read, and that was pretty much. I mean, I had friends, but sports. I mean, I have two sons, and when they grew up, everything has sort of become, and probably even more so, where, kids are. Their schedules are very complicated, and they do this, and they do this, and they do this, and we would, I mean, you've heard this before, but it's true. We'd leave in the morning and then come back at night, and we'd go and we'd play games, and nobody was worried about being snatched, as the son of a friend that I work with has said that he's worried about. So it was just, we just were out, and we were just kind of running around and playing basketball and football and baseball, and I did play organized baseball, and I have an older brother, and he was the one who was interested in that, and he was he was the one who did those things with me, not my father, and so that was kind of, but it wasn't we weren't a literary family. We weren't. They were simple people in a certain way, and my mother was lovely, and they both had very good senses of humor, and they were up on reading the newspaper, but there weren't a lot of books. People weren't reading books in my house, and other than me.
What were you reading?
I don't really remember, but I liked to read. I mean, I had a collection of comic books. So, I mean, what I've learned about reading, and it really doesn't matter what you read. I mean, it just matters that you read. It's like we talked about this, where you said when your father came to America and he would learn English by watching television. It doesn't matter. You can watch cartoons, you could watch, the McNeil Lehrer Report. You're just hearing the language and you're learning the language. And you read, I read kids' books, the Hardy Boy books, I don't remember, stuff like that. And then I moved on to different kinds of fiction. And I was an English major, so I loved to read. It was something that was fun for me, and it was easy, and it wasn't a struggle. It wasn't like, oh God, I got to read this book, this novel.
Did you have an idea for vocation at that point? Did you have an idea, or did your parents have an idea for you of what you should be when you grow up?
Well, I think a lot of immigrant parents, for my father, it was to be a lawyer, he thought. And he's a Jewish guy, and so a lawyer is, the law. And also it was a profession, and it was something where you would be able to take care of yourself. And that was sort of the goal. For me, I really didn't know. I mean, I didn't... I knew that I was going to go to college. I mean, I'm the youngest of four siblings, and we all went to college, City College. God bless City College. And I still have very strong feelings for that place, because it really it allowed us, it gave us access to the middle class. And without that, I don't think that we would have had that opportunity. I mean, my parents, they didn't have the money for us to go to different college, to go to a private college. And because I was the youngest, it was sort of, when you're the youngest, you're furthest from the mother's ship, and so you have the most freedom. And in a way, I had a lot of benign neglect, and it turned out to be a good thing. I mean, my parents loved me, but they weren't, they were older when I was born, and interestingly enough, my oldest sibling, who got married when I was 7, so she's 13 years older than me. When she was graduated high school, my parents apparently, of course I didn't know this at the time, I wasn't involved in this, but thought that she was going to be a secretary. And back in the day, it was sort of if you were a girl, you were supposed to learn how to type. And my wife, her mother had told, she's much younger than my oldest sister, but her mother said, do not learn how to type, because women were you were going to become a secretary. So my sister was going to then get a job as a secretary when she graduated from high school, but one of her teachers came over to the house, apparently, my sister told me this, and told my parents that this girl has to go to college. And so they were like, they were told that their kid had to go to college, and she did go to college, and she went to City College, and even though I grew up in Queens, I went to City College, which is in Harlem, instead of Queens College, because my sister, then my brother, and then my sister went there, so I went there.
And you did very well.
I did really well, and I got a fellowship to go to graduate school, and I did that, and when I was in graduate school, I kind of knew that I wasn't an academic. I knew it, and I had friends so I didn't want to I knew then I didn't want to just teach in university, and I left after getting a master's degree. But I had started writing earlier than that. I started writing pretty much in high school. And like a lot of guys, it was, I went from sports to writing poetry because it seemed that girls weren't all that interested in baseball. They sort of liked sensitive guys who were writing poetry. So I started doing that, and I continued doing that. And then I wrote a children's book, which didn't get published, and I wrote a novel, which didn't get published. But I started writing, and I was thinking, well, what can I do? I don't really have any skills. I mean, I didn't want to go to law school. I thought I could be a teacher, or I could be a lawyer, but if you don't really have any skills, if you don't really have anything that you know how to do, I learned very early on that being a tile man was really hard work, and I knew that wasn't for me because both my brother and I did work with my father when we were kids. It's really hard work.
Yeah, imagine.
And so I didn't want to work that hard. I didn't want to do that, but I didn't want to be a lawyer, and I didn't really know. I didn't really know what I had no idea. I didn't know, as I said, I didn't know that people did what I do. And I'm jumping ahead. Do you want me to?
Go wherever you would like to go, and I'll guide
Well,
you
it's
back.
sort of how I got into this. And
Yes.
so I have 2 sisters, and my sister Ruth, when she got married, at her wedding, I was, 23 or 24. I was in graduate school. And I had a lot of notions about writing that were, graduate school guy notions. I don't even remember what they were. And I met a guy at her wedding who was married to her best friend who grew up in the same building, the apartment building where we grew up in Queens. And I was talking to this guy and talking to him about literature or whatever I was talking about. And I asked him, I said, well, what do you do? And he said he was a screenwriter. And I guess I knew enough to know that I don't really know what I knew, but I was kind of like, I said, well, so you write movies? And he said, yeah. And I said, well, what movies have you written that I've seen? And he said, nothing. And I thought, this is interesting, because he lived in Westport, Connecticut. Now, you're nodding because you're from the East Coast. That's the equivalent of sort of like living in Brentwood in Los Angeles. It's a beautiful, upper-class, suburban town. And I thought, this is an interesting profession. The guy lives in Westport, Connecticut. He either has incredibly wealthy parents, but he's a screenwriter, but he hasn't written anything I've ever seen. And I said, so you write, I said, can I see what a screenplay looks like? He said, sure. And he was very generous, and he sent me a screenplay. I started writing them, and they weren't very good. And at a certain point, he said to me, look, if I were you, I'd go to California. If you want to earn a living, you're going to have a much easier time earning a living in California than you are here. And he was 10 years older than me and had a family and kids, and he couldn't just pick up and move his whole family. And I then left graduate school, and I had a master's degree, and I, again, didn't know what to do, and I just got in a car with a friend of mine who also wanted to go out to California to be a writer, and then I sort of found myself in Los Angeles and didn't really know what I was doing, but I thought, well, okay, I'm going to try to be a screenwriter.
No agent.
Well, what happened was this guy, his name is David Wiltsey, and he's been a very successful writer. He introduced me to a producer in New York whose name was Carol Baum, or is Carol Baum. And when I was going to California, she gave me a list of some people to call. And one of them was an agent whose name is Joan Scott, was Joan Scott. And Joan Scott had founded an agency in California called the Writers and Artists Agency, which I think may still be around. It was a small boutique agency, but a good agency. And so I got to California and I called her up and I said, I'm here, and I didn't want to send her any of my lousy screenplays, so I sent her my novel. And she said, sure, I'll read the novel. Anyway, she said that she was interested, and I went in and I met with her, and I subsequently actually met her a few years ago back in New York, and she of course didn't remember me, but I remembered her, and so I guess I had an agent. I had actually had an agent in New York for my children's book, which is another story. But anyway, I'm there in California, and I have this woman, Joan Scott. She said, "Well, we've got to help you get some work." And she said, "Well, here's the thing. The first thing you should do is you should write a spec script for a television show." And I said, "What's a spec script?" And she said, "Well, you write an episode for this television show, and then I will send it in to the people who work on the television show." And I said, "Well, what happens then?" She said, "Well, if they like it, well, maybe they'll buy it, or they'll give you a job writing something for that television show." And I said, "So what if they don't like it?" And she said, "Well, what do you mean?" And I said, "Well, do you send it to another television show?" She said, "No, we can't do that. No television show isn't interested in reading a script for another television show." And I said, I said, and she had the name of a television show. It was called Del Vecchio. I remember that. And I looked at her and I said, well, and this was, we had talked about this. There's sort of an advantage and a disadvantage to knowing too much or too little.
Right.
And I said, well, that seems kind of a silly waste of time to write a spec episode for a television show, and then if they don't buy it, you just throw it into the trash heap. Nobody ever wants to see it. She said, well, that's what I would suggest you do. And I said, okay, well, I'll write the first act of the spec script.
You can negotiate. You should have been a lawyer.
Well, and she kind of, and God bless her. I mean, she didn't look at me and saying, "What are you, a fucking idiot?" I mean, what am I supposed to do with like 15 pages of a 1-hour television episode? And I did. I wrote one act of and she didn't tell me not to do that. And then I went home and I said, well, this is really this doesn't seem like a smart thing to do. So I said, well, what I'm going to do, I'm going to write a play. And I hadn't written a play. I said, I'll write a play that's a full-length play with just 3 people in it who just talk. And that way, people can see that I can write dialogue. And I can send it out to different theaters. And it isn't like a television show where you send it to the Del Vecchio theater, and if they don't want it, you have to throw it away. And maybe somebody will put the play on. And that way I'll have something as opposed to just a spec script, which if it doesn't work for that show, maybe I can. And so I did. I wrote a play, and it got produced in Los Angeles. And although I then there was a guy. I had a good friend who worked in New York. This is a few years down the line. I went to California when I was 25, and I suppose I'm like 27 now or something. And I had a friend who'd gotten an MBA and was working for CBS and knew this guy who was an executive at NBC, but in current programming, and was a young guy, like one of those 20-something guys who got a job working for a network, and she brought him to my play. Well, the guy's name is Jeff Sagansky, and he actually became somebody who ran CBS and then ran TriStar Motion Pictures, and he saw my play, and I didn't hear from him for probably about a year or so. But then eventually, at one point, he called me up and he gave me an episode to write on a television show called The Neighborhood that was never got on the air, but it was Jimmy Breslin, a famous journalist, had created the show, and he gave me an episode to write on that. So it actually, writing the play did result in something. And of course, I didn't know, that he was going to turn out to be this guy who ran the network, years later, or ran a movie studio. But I learned something early on, and it's something that you said, well, one of the things you talk about is advice for young people, and I've given this to my sons, and I take it for myself. Yes is a better word than no. Yes creates possibilities, and no just ends possibilities. Yet no is a steel curtain, and that doesn't mean you should say yes to everything, but you always have the no card in your pocket. You can always pull it out anytime you want. So I learned that unless you really, really don't want to do something, I mean, what the hell, I mean,
How are you supporting yourself with the play?
Well, that's a good question. When I went to that's a great question, and that's what my parents were concerned about. And I there's a story before I went to I had worked when I was in college, and I went to City College, and I didn't live with my parents, and I lived with my friends. I lived in the West Village and the East Village, and I had a number of jobs, but I had one job which was a great job. I lucked into, and but anyway, when I was going to California, and I sat down with my dad, and he was listening, and he I said, well, here's what I want to do, and I said, I want to go to California, and I want to become a screenwriter, and I could write for television, or I could write for movies. And I told him about David Wiltse. I said, well, and you can write something and they don't make it, but they pay you for it, even if they don't make it. And my father was listening to me, and it was as if I said to him, I thought about this. So what you do when you get out there is you get a job, and you get in a rocket ship, and they send you to Mars, and you get out of the rocket ship, and you dig up all these rocks, and then you get back in the rocket ship, and you come back to Earth, and then you go home and you take a shower, and you go out and eat dinner with your friends, and they pay you like $100,000 a year to do that. And I asked my father for $500. And I needed the money, but I also wanted him to understand what I wanted to do, because I wasn't going to go to law school, and I wasn't going to get my PhD. And he had a great line. He looked at me and he said, no. And I said, why not? And he said, my head's too small. My father was a tile man. You don't get paid not to do work. You pay him to do the tile in your bathroom. And if he doesn't do the tile in your bathroom, he doesn't get paid. So the notion that you could actually get paid to write a movie that doesn't get made, right, $100,000 or $50,000 or $5,000 or $1 million, was to him crazy. He had no frame of reference for that, so he didn't give me the money. So I went out to California, and I struggled, and I had saved $4,000, and I was on unemployment. And I made it last. I lived in really shitty places, and I ate ramen, and but I made it last for a long time. But eventually, I was running out of money, and I had to get new brakes for my car, and I didn't have the money. And one of my sister's husbands, the one who I met David Wiltse at her wedding, her husband was a lawyer, and he always said, "Don't become a lawyer." He said, "You'll hate it. You'll hate it. It's just awful. You just work for other people. You basically just, you can walk around and tell people you're a lawyer, but it's awful." And he gave me $1,500. As far as I'm concerned, he was like the greatest guy in the world. And I got a job in L.A. and it's a whole other story. I had the worst job ever, but I got another play out of it that got produced. And so for 3 years I was not, I was actually, in retrospect, I did great. I had a play produced.
Yeah.
Me and 2 friends sold a story to Walt Disney. My friend David Assail, who I came out to LA with, who was my best friend, and Martha Coolidge, who became a very successful director and also the head of the Directors Guild. And we had met when she was AFI, American Film Institute intern on a movie called Audrey Rose. And we were all staying at this hotel, at the Montecito Hotel. And so Martha said, you know, I actually came up with this idea that was sort of like James Bond for kids, and we all wrote it together, and we got it sold to Disney, but they wouldn't let any of us write the script. But I had made a couple of grand. It was like $7,000 divided 3 ways or something. And I got $500 for the play, and I was on unemployment. But anyway, I was running out of money, and I was really thinking, you know, this isn't working. Just isn't working. I'm 28 years old, and because I didn't have a rich father, and I was terrified that I was going to be, you know, working at, thank God it's Fridays, you know, when I'm 40 years old. And in my head, I was sort of like, I had fallen off the Love Boat, and everybody's on the Love Boat having a great time, drinking margaritas and partying, and I'm in the ocean as the boat's getting further and further away. So I had a lot of anxiety, and I had a friend who was teaching at LaGuardia Community College here in New York. And she and another friend, Mary Pat Kelly, who, my friend Roseanne Lido and Mary Pat, they were teaching there. And they said, well, we're going to try to get you a job teaching at community college. And I thought, well, okay, I'll go back home. You know, that's it. Didn't happen. And I went back to New York to visit, and there was a hiring freeze in New York then. It was the mid-'70s. The city had gone bankrupt, and I couldn't get a job. So I was stuck in LA. And I went back to LA, and then I got an opportunity to write for, I mean, I'm skipping some stuff, obviously, but to write for The White Shadow, which is was a great opportunity, and God bless John Falsey. And I took to it like a terrier to a bone then, because it was like, you know, back in the day when I started out, you know, you were either a movie writer or a television writer. And really the brass ring was movies. I mean, you know, and so, you know, you just wanted to be television, television. You know, it's movies. Movies is, and I sort of bought into it. And you kind of like, well, if you write for television, you're not going to get into movies. You know, it's sort of like once there is a, you know, there's a steel curtain between these two disciplines or whatever. And so I was trying really to write for movies, and but when I got the opportunity on The White Shadow, it was like, you know, pride had nothing to do with it. It was like, I don't want to be that guy in the middle of the ocean when the Love Boat is, you know, I can't get to it. So I jumped at it, and of course I learned over time. Another thing I learned that all the membranes between all the vectors, all the delivery systems are permeable. It was bullshit. It was just, and then of course looking back at it, Clint Eastwood, who I got to work with on Spielberg's show, and Steve McQueen. I mean, all these guys came out of television. It was like, who made up these rules? You know, now I'm sure it's the same thing. Well, it used to be if you write a sitcom, you can't get into drama, and if you write a drama, you can't get it. I mean, it was like, you know, it was so
buckets, yeah.
Yeah, and it kept you from trying things. It kept you from doing things because you thought you were going to be pigeonholed. Now, listen, there is a degree of that that's true in anything in life. I mean, if you're a real estate lawyer and you want to be a criminal attorney, you know, you're a lawyer, but it's like a different, you know, but you can move. And you know, and I see it with young people now. Now, of course, things are all digital, and now things are, you know, if you write something for telephone, maybe they tell you can't write it for a television. I mean, I don't know what they're saying. No, or maybe those things are sort of dissolving, and the culture in general has become less sort of stratified. And so it isn't just specific to the entertainment industry. But back in that day, it was really, you thought that was it. And I've worked in movies, and I've directed a motion picture, and it was only because of my success in television. It was the only reason it happened. It wasn't a negative. It was the positive. If I wouldn't have had that, I never would have had that opportunity. Right. So what it is, other than sort of buying into the bullshit, it's just sort of realizing that the membranes are there and they're permeable, and things filter through them in both directions. It's not a one-way street, in all different kinds of directions. And Spielberg was someone who also said that and always acknowledged it. I mean, he would say the difference between television and movies, or he once said to me, was the difference between this and this. And of course, the other thing was at that time, the televisions were square, and now they're rectangle. Well, movie theaters were rectangle, and so when televisions were square, you had to have close-ups of people because two shots didn't look quite as interesting as they looked on a rectangle. But now that all TVs and movie theaters are the same shape and the same format, whatever the numbers are anymore, I don't remember, 1.85 or something, but then also the way they were shot became similar in a certain way. So a lot of, and it goes back to not knowing too much or not knowing enough. It was not knowing enough was sort of listening to what other people said, but then also trying things, writing a play instead of writing spec scripts. I didn't know. I mean, that this was the way you get in or not get in. So there was an advantage and there was a disadvantage. I obviously now most kids who go into this, or a lot of them, come out of film school, and you learn a lot of stuff in film school. And I've taught at film school. I've taught at NYU and I taught at UCLA in the graduate school. And there's good things, and there are things that are not so good. And but we all have our own journey, and my journey sort of started where it started, and there I was getting an opportunity to work for the White Shadow. Took to it. By then again, looking back, I really had done pretty well, but at the time I thought I was this close to the end.
Right.
And then things moved fairly quickly from there, but again, it's sort of like now everyone in television has a producer credit, and really what it means is a degrading of a producer credit. I mean, nobody knows what a producer does anymore, but a producer is a real job. And I know some wonderful producers who are real producers, and they know how to put together, whether it's a television show or a movie or anything, from soup to nuts. Mm-hmm. But now everybody has a producer credit. And back in the day when I did The White Shadow, I had to write 6 episodes for them before they made me a story editor.
Talk about the whole process. How did that happen? How did it come about that you got on White Shadow? It was your first actual staff writing
It was
position,
the first staff job I had. I had done another thing I'd done, which I can tell you, The White Shadow was really what I consider my first job. I had sold. I was hired by a television show prior to that called Operation Petticoat,
right.
And that's when I was between the ages of like 25 and 28, when I was in California struggling. I had a friend, Richard Brestoff, and he was an actor who was on this television show called Operation Petticoat, which was a TV show they're making from the movie. And he said, you should write a spec episode for that show. They say it's going to get picked up. And I was already said,
no.
But I said, I'm going to write a spec episode. And I wrote an episode. I wrote an episode in my head that was MASH in a submarine. There wasn't any television show I could see, so I thought it was good. And I had a different agent then, and the agent sent it in to some guy who was the story editor, or executive story editor, Cy something or other. And he called my agent and said, this guy knows more about the show than I do. And I went in there. And they proceeded for the next 2 months to rip me off as far as I was concerned. Now, all writers have those I was ripped off stories. But I would go in and give them ideas, and they'd take the ideas, and they never gave me a job. And they took the episode that I had written, in my opinion, and they turned it into a 2-parter, but they didn't give me any credit for it, and they wrote it, and they changed it. And finally, at the end, I just said, they wanted me to come in anymore, and I just said no. I just felt like, I just got tired of basically being fucked up the ass, and it was just, I'm not going in there anymore. And then they gave me a teleplay, and so I got a teleplay credit, and I was in the Writers Guild. And,
that's what got you in the Writers Guild.
That's what got me in the Writers Guild. And I didn't know how important that was or not important that was, but I was in the Writers Guild. So then with The White Shadow, I was playing softball with some guys from New York my friend Nick Millay, and playing softball out there. And he said to me, one of the guys we're playing softball with, this guy Mark Rubin, and he works on this television show called The White Shadow. And I said, really? Okay. And I I had this awful job, it was a great job, but it was a terrible job. I hated it. I used to cry every morning before I went to the
What,
job.
was this the one that got you the play? What was it?
Well, I can, no, yeah, well,
Another terrible job.
It was a terrible job. I'd have to explain what it was. I was a grip, but I was not, a grip is a good job. I've worked on movies and television, so it's a good job, it's a skilled job. The hierarchy in the entertainment business is, at the top of it is whatever, director, studio head, movie star. At the bottom is something called craft services. Now, you would probably know craft services, or I did, as the place where you get food from. That's not what craft services are at the low end of the totem pole. Craft services are when you go into a sound stage after the stage has been broken down, after they've shot on the stage back in the day. The person who sweeps up the stage, the untouchables, and who take the nails out of the floor of the stage are craft services. And the next level up are what's called grips, but they're not show grips. They're not gaffers and people who know how to build stuff. And what you do is you basically either take down the backings, take down the sets, or put up the backings if they're going to shoot or when they're done shooting. And there was and the other thing is if you go into a soundstages can be hundreds of feet high. And I'm afraid of heights. And there's usually, if you go into one, you'll see a ladder against the wall. And if you look up on that ladder, you'll see at the top of it, there's sort of a catwalk of sort of this little catwalk that sort of traverses the top of the soundstage. Well, the reason for that catwalk, although this has changed since the 70s, I feel like, is this boring?
No, not at all. This is the real nuts, the real nuts and bolts.
Well, okay, so it used to be that what you would do is if you had a set, let's say the set is the hotel room, and now, of course, you have a light over there and there's a light over there, but they used to basically hang lights, not even from the walls of the set. What they used to do is they used to create, let's say it's a rectangle, they would create, let's say 5 or 10 feet above this, another rectangle of sort of a catwalk.
Right.
And from that rectangle, which is about, if this is 15 feet high, say 20 or 25 feet high, they would hang the lights. Well, how do you create that rectangle? Well, you climb up this ladder, and at the top of the ladder, they have what they're called permanents, which are 2x12 wooden, a grid of 2x12 wooden things at the top of it, and they crisscross it. And what happens is, and they're 4 feet apart. So you have a 2x12 there and a 2x12 here. One guy walks out on the 2x12 here, and one guy walks out on the 2x12 there, and each guy puts a grappling hook on it and suspends a chain down to the floor. And at the bottom of the floor, there's a guy who attaches one end of that grappling hook to what they called a bed, which is a piece of something that creates a floor that you could walk on. It's like maybe it's 2 feet wide or 3 feet wide by 4 feet wide, and you put so one guy pulls it up, and the other guy pulls it up.
You were one of those guys.
Well, I'll get to that. And what they do is at a certain height, and then they secure it, and then they do another one, and so you eventually create this rectangle that, the cinematographer, these guys could walk around and could hang the lights from. Now, there is no safety net when you walk out on the permanents. And so if the guy next to you sneezes when you're pulling the thing up, you could go falling. And people apparently had died. They fall from there, and that's it. And it's scary as shit. And my friend who I had moved from New York with was living somewhere, and he said, and he knew I needed a job. He said, Josh, there's somebody who lives in my apartment complex, and she works for the studio, and they have this program called the Permit Program for people who want to get into the union, the grip union, and she can get you to the head of the list. So what happened is they had a program for people theoretically to get into the union. And they trained them by having them do this work.
Wow.
And now...
Like initiation.
Now here's the thing. If you worked 30 days straight, you could get into the union. Or if you worked 90 days out of the year, you could get into the union. The good news for me is they fired you after 29 days or after 89 days because they didn't want to let you into the union. Now, I was on this crew with guys who were like they were hard guys. I mean, they were guys who got out of prison. It was a way for black guys theoretically to get into the union because they probably didn't have any black guys in the union back then. And so there I was, and there was one other white guy on the crew, and they called him Nutwood. Because he had been like a white-collar guy. He was like an insurance executive who wanted to be a guy. He wanted to wear a tool belt. You know, he wanted to be out there and stuff. I'd have to get in, go to work in the morning. It was like dark out. I'd sit in the car. I couldn't go up in that thing. I couldn't climb the ladder. I couldn't do it. So, and the guy who was the boss of the crew, Red, and he would go out there and he'd smoke a cigarette walking on these permanents, you know, like, he just, you know, with his hands in his pockets, you know, and it was like, they were like hard guys. And he knew that I couldn't do it. And they didn't torture me the way they tortured Nutwood. You know, they'd say, hey, Nutwood, we need some grip wax. And he'd go, oh, I'm on it, boss. And he'd run out and they'd start laughing. Go, what's so funny? He goes, no such thing as grip wax. You know, they would torture him. But he let me be the guy on the bottom, on the floor, who would attach so I am a lucky guy in life. And you got to be lucky in life. That's another thing I learned. I mean,
Lesson
goes with
one.
being yes. Yes is a better word than no. So anyway, so while I was working as a grip, one day I had a bunch of ideas, and I called Mark Rubin's office to see if I could pitch them to the White Shadow, and they said, "Oh, we're sorry, we bought the last idea." I was devastated. It was like,
Had you
know,
seen the show?
I did, and that's how so what happened is that back in the day, when I wanted to pitch an idea, they had me go on the CBS lot, MTM lot, whatever it was called back in the day, and I was in a room, and there was a television set, a square television set, and there was another guy in the room, and he was there to watch the pilot with me. Turned out to be John Falsey, and we watched it, and we kind of liked each other, and we hit it off, and I said, well, let's get a cup of coffee. And he had just come to Los Angeles. He had graduated from the Iowa Writers Workshop, and he had sold a story. He had written a story that the New Yorker published, and it had been published, and it had gotten optioned in Hollywood. So he had come to Hollywood. And in his words, I said, well, why don't you just keep writing short stories? He said, well, I don't know if I'm really that good. He said, but I know I'm good enough to basically make it here. So he didn't know anybody in LA. He didn't say that at the time, right that day, but it was one of the reasons he sort of came. He said he did know television. He liked television, and he knew it, and he had grown up in Darien, Connecticut, and his father was a lawyer, you know, and but he didn't know anyone in LA, and I invited him. I said, well, why don't you come have Thanksgiving with me and my girlfriend, you know, and it became my wife. And he said, no, that's all right. Anyway, the next day he calls me after I couldn't pitch my ideas. He goes, guess what? They bought my idea. And I was very happy for him, but unhappy for myself. And I was in the Writers Guild. I said, well, you got to join the, you know, we talked a little bit. I hung up and I was like, oh, God, shit, you know. I mean, he was a nice guy. And I didn't hear from him again, and I didn't speak to him again. But that Christmas, which was the third year when I went back to New York to see if I could get a job teaching at LaGuardia Community College, I'm on the red eye. It's the first time I've been back to New York in 3 years since I moved there. And I hear somebody saying, yeah, I just sold my second script to the White Shadow. And I look around, and there's John Falsey on the plane. And I go, hey, John Falsey, right? And he goes, yeah. I sit next to him, we're talking, we're laughing. He's telling me about his other script. And I say, yeah, I'm going back. I don't know what's going to happen. And I say, hey, we're going to a New Year's party. You want to come? And he goes, nah, I got to write the script and go back to Connecticut. That was the end of that. I go back to California because I can't get the job in LaGuardia Community College. And I get a call from John Falsey, and he says, yeah, you know, why don't you come in and pitch your ideas? There's something opened up. So I go in and I pitch my ideas to Mark Rubin, and he doesn't buy any. He buys them. And I write them up, or he buys one or two of them, but that was it. Cut me off. Didn't want me to write. You know, I didn't get to go to teleplay to any of them, but I made a little bit of money because they bought 2 stories, and that was the end of it. But I was devastated. I was just like, shit, I can't get in. I can't get in. And then one day I get a call months later out of the blue, and they go, hi, it's John Falsey, and I'm a story editor of the show, and Mark Rubin is listen, I have to write an episode. It's got to be done in 3 days. Would you write it with me? I said, absolutely. I'm like, I don't know this guy. I met him on a plane, watched the thing, and I was nice to him. He seemed like a nice guy. Yeah. So I did that, and I wrote they then gave me another one. And then I wound up writing 6 episodes for them. And then the following year, Mark Rubin either quit or got fired. And John Falsey was a story editor. And then I got the job to be a story editor on The White Shadow. And so Falsey and I were both story editors. We weren't partners. And on The White Shadow then, Bruce Paltrow was the executive producer. And Mark Tinker was a producer. And John Macias was not a writer. He was an associate producer, I think. And Scott Brazil worked on the show. But the only people who wrote were me and Falsey. Nobody wrote. There were no writing producers.
You weren't partners at that point?
No. We were just the 2 story editors on the show. And
what did it mean to be a story editor?
well, I mean, again, what it meant is you were a writer then. I don't know what it means now. Now, I guess we have a story editor and we have a diversity writer on The Americans and stuff, and you just write. But essentially, I'm a consulting producer, and we have producers on the Americans, and we're just writers. That's what we are. We're writers. The showrunners are the producers. They're the ones who make all the decisions about, pre-production, production, post-production, as it should be. But we all have different titles, and that's how you define yourself in the business, and it's how you make more money. So I mean, it's an important thing to work for titles because they do reflect money generally in any profession. If you're chief of surgery at some medical institution, you're going to get paid more money than if you're just the assistant surgeon. So we were the guys who wrote. We were the 2 people who wrote all the stories and the scripts, and we either hired writers or we wrote them ourselves.
Did you divvy it up, or how did you write one episode? He wrote one episode, or did you tackle different?
Well,
storylines?
I think we did all
that.
of that. I mean, we would write some together. We would write them separately, and then some of them we would farm out. Like, I'm a good friend of Marshall Herskovits's, Marshall Herskovits and Ed Zwick. But Marshall, back in the day, he had gone to AFI and wanted to be a director. But I got him to write an episode of The White Shadow. He wanted to do it. We're the same age. We met, and he had kids when I had kids, and so we knew each other back then. So there were writers who wrote episodes, and then I would write some, Falsey would write. We would work out the stories together. And sometimes with one of the writers, if that writer would be working on an episode. The way it worked back then also is, or one of the things I remember is, on a television show, this was a network television show, there wasn't cable back then. So I believe that if you had 13 episodes, 2 of them had to be reserved for freelance writers. That's no longer the case. And as unions all across America have gotten weaker, the Writers Guild, the Directors Guild, and SAG to a certain extent, they've concentrated on their health fund, and they've all gotten weaker as well, and residuals, and pension. So a lot of the other stuff has gone by the wayside. Now we don't have to reserve episodes for freelance writers, and it's made it more difficult for freelance writers. It's more difficult than it used to be back in the day. Now you can say, well, there's a lot more delivery systems, and there are, but a lot of them don't pay. And it's the same thing, not just for writers, it's for actors, and top of show is not what it used to be, and for directors, and so it used to be that the wonderful character actors who we all know, and we've seen them in movies. It's much more difficult to have a career like that as an actor, and it's much more difficult to have a career as a freelance director or as a freelance writer than it used to be back in the day. So we were not partners. Falsey and I were not partners, but we were friends and we liked each other. And then The White Shadow was going to end. That was the last year of The White Shadow. And Grant Tinker, who was an amazing guy, ran MTM, and he basically asked me what I wanted to do next. And he asked Falsey what he wanted to do next. And Falsey was going to write a mini-series about Northern Ireland. And he was excited about that. And I, well, to backtrack, when I went to City College and I said I had a roommate, my roommate for several years was my best friend who I grew up with, Lance Luria. And Lance, I've known him since he was 10, and he, is an extraordinary guy. And anyway, what happened is he went to He went to Staten Island Community College and he went to Bronx Community College. So he didn't even get into City College, and he graduated. And his father had been a cop in the Depression, a Jewish cop, and got to college, CCNY. And Lance graduated, and he didn't know what he wanted to do, and he used to play the guitar and would make stuff, and what he was a karate guy, and anyway, he took an aptitude test or something, and they said, "Hey, you should be an auto mechanic or something like that." And one day he says to me, he said, "I'm gonna become a doctor." I said, "Really? Okay, what are you gonna do?" He goes, "Well, I'm gonna go to France. I'm gonna take a couple of courses," and he said, "I'm gonna go to France." So he went to France. Comes back a year later, and I said, "Hey, what's going on?" I'm still living in the apartment, and I haven't moved to Los Angeles yet. And he goes, "Well, it's not going to work. I'm going to flunk out of medical school in France." I said, "Really? Why?" He said, "Well, the way medical school in France works is, you just go into a big lecture hall. There's like 1,000 people, and there's a guy who talks, and you don't have to go to the lecture. You can just buy the notes afterwards, and so there's no interaction with anyone." And Lance was a hands-on guy. He made things that he sold. He's a friendly guy. He drove a cab. He was a people person. I said, "Well, what are you going to do?" He said, "Well, I'm going down to Guadalajara. I'm going to see if I can get into medical school down there. And if I can, I'm going to grab my stuff out of France, and I'm going to, I'll go there." I said, "Well, you don't speak Spanish. You don't speak Mexican." Spanish. He goes, "Yeah, I know. Listen." I said, "Well, you sure you can't work it out in France?" I mean, because it's not going to work. I'm just going to, I hate it. I'm going to flunk out. Goes down to Mexico. Comes back 3 days later. I say, "How'd it go?" He goes, "I can't get into Guadalajara." I said, "So what are you going to do?" He goes, "Well, it's very interesting. I'm driving to the airport to make my plane back, and I pick up a guy. He's hitchhiking. And the guy tells me he's a journalist. And he says, if I bring him back 3 suits, Pierre Cardin suits from Paris, from France, he'll get me into medical school in Monterrey, Mexico." And I said, "Really?" He said, "Yeah." I said, "What's," he goes, "Now, Monterey is not an accredited medical school, but he can get me in." I said, "It's not an accredited medical school. He's going to get you in." I said, "What are you going to do?" He said, "I'm going to bring him back the suits, and I'm going to go down there and see what happens." I said, "You should." "It's not going to work in France." Goes to Mexico, gives the guy the suits. The guy gets him into medical school in Monterrey, Mexico. It's unaccredited. He doesn't speak Spanish. He gets a Spanish girlfriend to help him translate the texts. He's there for 2 years. The medical school gets accredited, and he gets into Boston University to finish his medical school. Now, back to coordinating producer, supervising producer, co-executive producer, executive producer. The shingle he hangs in his office is medical degree from Boston University. And that's all anybody gives a shit about, right? Yeah. You don't care what public school I went to. You don't care if I... And then after he goes to Boston, to medical school in Boston, he graduates, he gets to do his residency at the Cleveland Clinic. Cleveland Clinic is one of the top hospitals in the United States. People had all those sheiks from Arabia, when they need open heart surgery, go to the Cleveland Clinic. So Lance and I are still friends. I'm working on The White Shadow. I would talk to him. He said, somebody ought to do a television show about what goes on in a teaching hospital. You would not fucking believe what goes on in this. It's unbelievable. So there's Grant Tinker, said, "What do you want to write next?" And I said, "I'd like to do a television show about a teaching hospital." And he goes, "Hill Street in the hospital." Now, Hill Street was not on the air yet. And I go, "Sure, I don't know what Hill Street is." So I've sold that to Grant Tinker.
That was it? That was the pitch, basically?
Yeah, I mean, I said, it's like, I don't know, I probably said a little bit more, but he basically, he heard about it, and I said, and this goes back to the golden age of television. I've lived through 3 golden ages, okay, so the second one, theoretically, if there ever is such a thing, started with Hill Street. And because it did change television in a lot of ways. What did it mean? It meant multiple stories in one television episode. It meant a fusion of comedy and drama. Mm-hmm. So you didn't have a single lead like in other television shows prior to that. If it was a drama, it didn't have to be just a drama. You could mix things, and I guess that's it. I mean, I think that those were it sounds like a small thing now, but prior to the Hill Street, they didn't have television shows that were sort of you could have black humor or comedy, and that you could have multiple stories. And of course, they started calling them A, B, and C stories, but they were just letters that you'd put on a story. We don't use those letters anymore. At least we don't on the Americans. So I'm supposed to go to do research for like 3 weeks at the Cleveland Clinic with Lance. Falsey's going to go off and write his miniseries on Northern Ireland. And Macius, who is not a writer yet, we decide to go on vacation to Mexico. Say goodbye to each other, We go and have fun in Mexico. And we get back and there's a telephone call. And Stu Irwin of MTM, who was Grant's right-hand guy, wants to meet us and wants to meet everybody from the White Shadow. And Bruce Paltrow was making a movie in New York. And we go into this meeting and Stu says, this is unbelievable, but Brandon Tartikoff at NBC wants to make a television show that takes place in a teaching hospital, and he wants to pick it up for 13 episodes. I'm like, Mark Tinker goes, I'm in, and Macius goes, I don't know. And Falsey goes, I can't do this if Josh doesn't want to do it. And I go, Stu, you just bought this from me. And he goes, well, no, it's not exactly the same. And I go, and again, I knew I was a peanut. I wasn't trying to be a wise guy. I just didn't know what to say. I didn't know what to do. I mean, so I said, I don't even know. I don't know how to respond. This is what you. And then he said, well, you could do the sequel by yourself. I mean, they want to basically do this whole thing. Anyway, so I walk out of there. I don't know what to do, and I got a call from Grant Tinker, and he was kind of mad at me. And I said, but Grant, you bought this. When did I buy it from you? And I told him when. Anyway, it turned out there was a reason why this all happened, and it was good. Nobody had bad intentions, but I didn't know what to say. And Bruce called me from New York and he said, well, what do you want, Josh? And I said, again, I didn't know enough to know what I wanted, But I said, well, I want to create the show. He said, fine, create the show. And I said, and I want to be a producer. And he said, fine, you're a producer. And I was like, okay. And then I went to talk to Mark, and I said, well, okay, I want to be a producer like you. And he goes, well, I'm not working for you. And I go, but I don't want to work for you. So we'll be equals. Shake hands. Grant Tinker's son, I'm going to be equals with him, schmuck that I am. But anyway, it doesn't matter. And so I go to Falsey, but they said 13 episodes on the air. And I said, well, hey, John, do you want to work on this show? And he goes, no, thanks. I'd rather do my thing on Northern Ireland. And I go, yeah, but they want 13 episodes. And I said, well, okay, do you want to do it with me? We'll be partners. He goes, absolutely. And so he shakes hands. So Falsey and I then go to the Cleveland Clinic, but not for 3 weeks, for like 3 days, because remember, they want 13 episodes.
That's right.
And because, God bless Lance, I mean, Lance is, doctors and cops are a fraternity that don't like to talk to people who are outside of the fraternity. They just don't like it. They don't trust them. But because, they trusted Lance, he would say, hey, tell me how you killed that guy last night, And I remember, and I used it in the pilot, and I actually remember a phrase. I don't remember the whole thing, but he was hemodynamically compromised. And so for 3 days we're there, and we come back, and we have all this stuff, this great material, and they were really opening up to us and telling us what it's really like being in this place, and how it's crazy. And then I don't remember where exactly in the process, but we saw the movie Hospital, Patty Chayefsky movie. And Hospital is a very dark, black, very dark comedy about an urban hospital in New York. And I thought, this is what the show should be. It should be like this. And we go to Grant, and we come up with this thing, and then we rewrite this thing, but it turns out that, lo and behold, it's not an episode for it's not a pickup for 13 episodes. It was really just a pilot script. And so we were just writing the pilot script, the thing that I had sold on my own, but now I have like a gazillion partners, and I'm going, how did this happen? How did it? And again, I didn't know enough, but I knew too much. I didn't, and I'll explain that in a second, I think. Anyway, so we write the pilot, and remember back in the day, this is NBC, and Hill Street had come on. but networks still weren't sure that something like this would work. Multi-story mixture of comedy and drama, with not one single lead. And so eventually we had to write 10 scripts before they picked up the show.
Yeah.
Well, this is something that you talk about regrets. I think that I was not, I didn't play well with others on that show. And it wasn't their fault, but I wasn't happy. I felt something, I was young. I was, I don't know, 30, 32 or something. And I had only worked on The White Shadow, and I felt that something was taken away from me. I felt like this is mine, And they were good guys and, or not good guys. I mean, but they weren't, they were just, and I had to learn, I had to learn something, and I kind of, and so I left after a year, but I was invited to leave. Falsey didn't have to leave. He played better with others. And also it wasn't really, it wasn't his. He didn't have a sort of that it isn't about how much you love something, it's sort of what your identification is with it. And I see it working with other people now, particularly when someone is doing something that's from their life. They're afraid that something's going to be taken away from them. And you have to assure them that it's not. Do you guys want to stop?
You're good. Let's take
Sure.
a quick break. Are you okay? Or is this okay, it was just an hour. Okay.